Over the last few dozen chapters of the manga, we've learned a lot of new information about the ongoings of the Revolutionary Army and some of the tendencies of the infamous Monkey D. Dragon. Most notably, his almost nonchalant complacency when his friends or subordinates are in danger. And while this has turned Dragon into somewhat of a controversial figure amongst the community, I think Oda is doing this all as a way to lay the groundwork for one of the oldest questions in One Piece, which is, what happened to Luffy's mom? I mean, how are we more than 1100 chapters deep into the story and we haven't heard a single word about her? Not from Luffy, not from his grandpa Garp, and surely not from his father Dragon, who struggles to say anything at all most of the time. But he would be the one man who, without a shadow of a doubt, knows about Luffy's mom, right? Could this maybe be the reason why Oda hasn't brought Dragon directly into a conflict just yet? I mean, who else could Oda possibly use to explain the situation about Luffy's mom? Maybe Garp could, but he's in custody of the Blackbeard pirates right now. And besides, Garp was already the one who told us Dragon was Luffy's dad in the first place, so I think it's time Dragon says something other than ... And we know for certain that Dragon has kept his family life under wraps because his two original commanders in the Revolutionary Army were left completely in the dark on it. I mean, Ivankov wasn't even sure he had a child at all, and when Kuma questioned Dragon about it, he said a child is a parent's weak spot, and that if you keep talking about this, you might as well kill me yourself. And Luffy was born after the Revolutionary Army started, so how could Dragon have possibly kept this all a secret? This means that Dragon is not only one of, if not the only character who can tell us about Luffy's mom, but there is also a deep and probably dark past regarding Luffy's origins that we need to learn about. And this is on top of whatever else is going on with Dragon's backstory, because he left the Marines, joined the Freedom Fighters, and started the Revolutionary Army all before Luffy was even born. And I think what makes his inaction so shocking to us readers is that his attitude is a far cry from what type of actions his son and father would have taken, because we've seen Luffy and Garp brazenly charge in to save their friends and comrades time and time again. That's like their whole shtick. They don't need plans at all, while Dragon is like the master planner. And I don't believe that's because Dragon has always been that kind of person. I think it's because something changed him along the way. He probably acted like Luffy and Garp in the past, but one time it bit him in a major way. And that's why he didn't go after his comrades or even Shaka once he called and said that he would die today. And this is a major reason why I've been diamond handing my Dragon stocks for years at this point. Oda's been trying to sink him lower and lower every chapter, it feels like, but I just keep on buying the dip. And for a lot of that time, I didn't even really have a strong theory about Dragon's past. I just kind of knew that Oda was going to cook when he got around to it. But that all changed when a theory hit me on the way home from Wendy's. And look, I know that there are countless theories out there already about Luffy's mom, from Croco Mom to maybe her being the missing Empress of Amazon Lily, who was recently revealed in an SBS to be someone named Toritoma, which makes that theory a bit less likely to me now, because why would Oda ruin that reveal? And there's even theories about her maybe being a commoner, something like Porcus D. Rouge, who, yes, was amazing for keeping Ace in her womb for 2 years, but she wasn't a major character in the grand scheme of things. But one theory that has been around for a long time that I think I finally have some evidence for is that Luffy's mom was a celestial dragon. And I'm sure that idea in and of itself isn't an entirely new idea to a lot of you, but from what I can tell from parsing through many Google searches and asking around on my Discord, this seems to be a new spin to the idea, and I think you guys are really going to enjoy. Because if Luffy's mom was a celestial dragon, she wouldn't just be any old celestial dragon, would she? It kind of makes intuitive sense that she would be some kind of important figure, doesn't it? I mean, Luffy's basically the chosen one, the warrior of liberation, and the future pirate king. So while I love the idea his mom is just like a normal person, this is a chosen one story at the end of the day. I mean, Luffy's dad is the leader of the revolutionaries, his grandpa is the legendary hero of the Marines, his mentor is an emperor of the sea and former apprentice of Roger, and even if you go back to Roger visiting Fishman Island, the Sea King spoke about how two sovereigns were almost born. One clearly being Shirahoshi, the newest iteration of Poseidon, and the other is probably Luffy because he's the newest iteration of Joy Boy, who is of course meant to return and make good on Joy Boy's apology by helping the Fishman return to the surface. I mean, Queen Otohime even mentioned that there will be someone to appear one day who can guide Shirahoshi and show her the right path. And I'd be very surprised if that's anybody but Luffy at this point. I mean, it sure isn't Vanderdecken. So that prophecy intertwines their stories even more, showing they almost almost had a destiny of some sort to meet and lead the world into the dawn. And this connection about the two sovereigns is really what lit the fire behind this entire theory. Because if these are the two sovereigns who were born into some kind of destiny, then perhaps their origins will mirror each other in some way too. And what place mirrors Fishman Island at the bottom of the sea better than the Holy Land of Marijois right above it at the top of the red line? Maybe one sovereign was born at the very bottom and one was born at the very top, meaning they started in completely opposite positions, yet one day they're going to work together to bring both groups to the middle, when Luffy brings the Celestial Dragons down by maybe destroying the red line, while Shirahoshi helps bring the fishmen up to the surface by using the Ark Noah, kind of making those two groups finally equal, which is a perfect segue to Shirahoshi's mom, Otohime, who is a crucially important character with tons of ties to the Celestial Dragons, and her goal was to fight for peace with the humans despite all the oppression the fishmen faced from the nobles. She wanted the fishmen to one day live on the surface to see the sun and everything else the world had to offer, which sounds a lot like what Luffy wants already. So what if Luffy's mom then parallels Otohime, but just on the other side, being a celestial dragon that tried to change the other celestial dragons from within? Maybe she even tried to protect the fishmen and the other slaves of the Holy Land, and hell, she could have even opposed all their native cleansings. It would almost be beautiful in a way if Luffy and Shirahoshi are like the example of children of two opposing factions working together for a common good. Because honestly, this is really just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to the connections between fishmen and celestial dragons. I mean, we have Ryugu Palace, which is the home of the fishmen royalty, and it features a giant dragon on top of it. And thanks to Kaido's devil fruit, the fish fruit model Azure dragon, we know that in One Piece, dragons and fish are basically cut from the same cloth. And now we don't really know why the celestial dragons are called by that name just yet, but the dragon factor between the two groups is pretty strong nonetheless. And hell, the celestial dragons even styled their hair like a whale's tail, and it was specifically said the whales would be the ones delighted to hear the sovereigns are almost born. But maybe the most important and unfortunate tie between these groups is that the celestial dragons have a very long history of enslaving fishmen, and that's given rise to a lot of the tensions that the fishmen felt towards humans, because the fishmen experienced the worst type of humans more than any other. And there are plenty of examples of this, like Kami at the auction house where Luffy punched Charlos, or when Shirahoshi was almost captured twice during the most recent reverie, or even the whole Fisher Tiger story, which basically goes hand in hand with Otohime's story. And I think in a lot of ways, Fisher Tiger could even parallel Dragon, which makes this whole thing even more convincing. I mean, he saved slaves directly from Marijois, which the revolutionaries did during the most recent reverie. And we've seen them do that in other places, such as Tequila Wolf or the islands that they liberated. And you know, Dragon holds a serious disdain for the Celestial Dragons, probably on a similar level to Fisher Tiger, but we just don't know exactly why yet for Dragon. And if you don't think that's enough to connect these two, well, don't forget that Koala is a direct connection between these characters, because she was taken home by Fisher Tiger, where he then died, but she still ended up joining the Revolutionary Army later down the line. I mean, hell, even their names are kind of similar, right? Because they both have two animals within it. You have Monkey D. Dragon, and then Fisher Tiger. And Fisher, I guess, is close enough to fish. And you know, a monkey is kind of a disrespectful way to refer to a human, and a fish is kind of a disrespectful way to refer to a fishman, so that could be a connection as well. And we even had Jinbei once talk about the contrasting styles of Otohime and Fisher Tiger, where Otohime endured the suffering of today for a better future, while Fisher Tiger abandoned the future to help the people here and now. And so if Luffy's parents do mirror these two characters, I could see them being just like Fisher Tiger and Otohime, but maybe the personalities were kind of flipped, where Dragon endures the hardships of today, or rather he makes his subordinates endure the hardships, all in the name of a better future without the Celestial Dragons. And then on the flip side, maybe Luffy's mom was a bit more like Fisher Tiger, abandoning the future so that she could help the people of today, maybe even freeing slaves in the process just like he did. In fact, in Chinese mythology, dragons and tigers are basically rivals, where the dragons are known for their patience and wisdom, and tigers are usually depicted as lunging ahead and bulldozing their opposition. Now, this probably represents the tie between Otohime and Fisher Tiger, because Otohime is based on a sea goddess who turned into a dragon, but I think Oda might be just doing the same thing here with Monkey D. Dragon and Luffy's mother. So basically what I'm saying here is that while Otohime fought for equality on behalf of the enslaved, what if Luffy's mom fought for equality amongst the enslavers, to try and change the Celestial Dragons from within so they could treat people of the world like equals? And perhaps just like Otohime, she too was even killed by her own people. Because don't forget that Hody Jones was the one who actually killed Otohime. He just framed a human to make the tensions between the groups even worse. And what's really important about that idea is that we just recently saw that very thing happen to a celestial dragon because of Don Quixote Mjosgard, someone who ties very closely to Otohime because she saved his life 10 years ago when he crashed at Fishman Island. She even took a bullet for him. And the reason that he was put to death after the reverie was because he repaid the favor to Otohime and protected her daughter Shirahoshi. The butterfly effect of that moment is crazy, but what's even crazier is that the one who put Mjosgard to death was Figarland Garling, who at the time was the supreme commander of the Gods Knights, because the Gods Knights are the ones who are responsible for ruling on issues between celestial dragons. And what character brought up the Gods Knights not that long ago? Dragon, because he was the one who said that when they mobilize, things get serious. Dragon knows that this group is a serious threat, and at least to me, Oda seems to be hinting that there will be an altercation between the two groups eventually. Perhaps this is because he has a past with them through Luffy's mom. Were they maybe the ones responsible for killing her, just like they did to Mjosgard? Maybe because she also decided to protect someone innocent? Now, to be honest, I wouldn't even be surprised if Mjosgard somehow is alive, because it's One Piece and we only saw him on the cross, but the point still stands. But this connection could make for an insane reveal when the Gods Knights finally get into action. I mean, just imagine Dragon fighting Garling if we learn that Garling's the one who actually killed Luffy's mom. That kind of thing would raise the stakes of their conflict so much more. And one thing that I always found kind of interesting is how Dragon's organizations never had any money. That's the main reason why Vegapunk couldn't join them. And I think that's just a great contrast to the Celestial Dragons, who obviously had nothing but money. I think it'd be really cool if we eventually found out that Luffy's mom was like giving Dragon some of the money she got from the Celestial Tribute, so he could just turn around and redistribute it back to the poor countries who need it. That would almost kind of remind me of Whitebeard a little bit, who always sent his money back to Sphinx Island. But you know, Dragon may not have even had these money issues in the first place if he just used the sponsor for today's video, Rocket Money. Because Rocket Money is the app you need to save more or manage your money better. I'm in the process of saving up for some major home renovations right now, like a new roof among other things, and I really want to get on top of my expenses, and Rocket Money can help me with that because not only does it help manage those pesky subscriptions, but also lower bills, build a custom budget, and grow my savings all in one place. I mean, I'm sure we've all had a subscription or two that falls through the cracks, maybe we forgot to cancel, or maybe we just don't use it anymore and forgot all about it, and Rocket Money not only safely and securely identifies those recurring charges, but you can also cancel the ones you don't want right within the app with just a couple of taps, and that means you get to skip all those customer service calls. And Rocket Money has helped save its customers up to $740 a year when they use all the app's features. And one of my favorite features on Rocket Money is how you can set budgets, where you can then analyze your spending habits by automatically monitoring your spending by category, so then you can get notifications when you exceed those spending limits so you can stick to your savings goals. So join the over 5 million members using Rocket Money today by heading over to rocketmoney.com/daxsake, or just use the link down in the description, where you can get started for free and get even more features by upgrading to premium. So thanks again to Rocket Money for sponsoring, but let's get back to the video. So now I want to back things up and kind of go through the timeline of events here for Dragon, because like I mentioned earlier in the video, Dragon was well on his way to becoming the most wanted man in the world before Luffy was even born, because the Revolutionary Army started 3 years prior to that. So we should probably talk about how he even met Luffy's mom in the first place, if she truly is a celestial dragon, because it's not like getting close to them and becoming friends with them is easy for an outsider, no less a wanted criminal like Dragon. And you know, he would also need enough exposure to her to kind of develop a connection and get the job done, which is confusing no matter who the woman was, because like I said, Luffy was born after the Revolutionary Army started, yet somehow Kuma Norivankov knew about him till much later on. So Dragon definitely had a sneaky link back in the day, and I think looking at his past could help us piece that puzzle together. So let's start back at the very beginning, where Dragon was born 55 years ago in the Goa Kingdom, and eventually he decided to join the Marines, likely at the behest of his dad Garp. However, he decided to leave the Marines at some point later on because he said that he found no justice there. And I really quickly want to point out that Dragon and Akainu are the same exact age, which means they probably enlisted around the same time. And I bet whatever it was that made Dragon leave in the first place only further cemented Akainu's loyalty and his pursuit of absolute justice, because now those two are obviously the leaders of opposing opposing factions, and I'm sure Oda is going to cook up something special between the two at some point. But the thing about all that is we don't know exactly when Dragon decided to leave the Marines just yet, and if we did, it would probably help explain what it was that made him do so, but we know it had to be before 25 years ago, and that's because that's the earliest we ever heard of him on the Freedom Fighters. And we also know that by that point, Dragon had even established a strong reputation for himself because we saw Kuma looking at his poster like he was some kind of role model, so it at least gives the implication that Dragon was probably doing his thing for a while by that point. And if you look back between 25 and 55 years ago for major events in the One Piece world that could have impacted Dragon enough for him to leave, I think there's one obvious answer that stands out, and that's God Valley. I mean, it happened 38 years ago, meaning Dragon would have been 17 years old, and that's about the right age for a mid-level military recruit. I mean, Kobe joined the Marines at 16, yes, he was 16 when the story started, and he's 18 now and carrying out important missions on his own, so the logistics there kinda line up. Dragon could have even had a higher rank than Kobe by this age, just because of nepotism, I guess, and that Dragon was probably a prodigy. But the reason that God Valley is really important in this context is that it could have provided the perfect chance for Dragon to first meet Luffy's mom, because at God Valley, we know the Celestial Dragons came and held what was called a native cleansing, where they basically wanted to wipe out the constituents of that island for sport. And this could have totally been what fueled Dragon's disdain for the Celestial Dragons that he still has today. I could honestly even see young Dragon at God Valley acting a bit like Kobe did in Marineford, where he just heard the voices of everyone dying around him, and he just wanted to save the innocent as opposed to helping the Celestial Dragons with their game. And you also have to think about the fact that Kuma, Ivankov, and Ginny were all at God Valley as well. It almost makes intuitive sense that Dragon would have been there also, where maybe all of them kind of had their views on the world changed by that event. And for Dragon, it could have been a bit like what Ohara was to Kuzan, because seeing such atrocities happen to innocent people in person, resulting in the entire island being wiped out, can definitely change a person. But the silver lining in all that is it could have been the start of Dragon's connection with Luffy's mom, because the Celestial Dragons don't leave Marijois all that often, right? And the reason I bring this up is that the Celestial Dragons then probably get a Marine escort whenever they do leave. I mean, when one gets hurt, they call in a whole buster call, so it kind of only makes sense that the Marines might be tasked with protecting them when they're out at sea. I mean, someone has to do it, you know Charlos isn't going to. So maybe the way Dragon met Luffy's mom is that he was in charge of escorting her. And I think it would be perfect if they met under those kind of circumstances, because then they could have had time to have some dialogue with one another before even arriving there. So maybe Dragon could start seeing that not all Celestial Dragons are the same, just like pirates, Marines, and so forth. Some are good and some are bad. I mean, maybe she even opposed the cleansings entirely and didn't even want to get off the boat. Maybe she tried getting her people to quit them altogether, which almost allured Dragon toward her. And hey, Luffy met Boa when he was 17 years old, and Dragon would have theoretically met Luffy's mom when he was 17 if this idea is true, so that kind of lines up too. Boa also escorted Luffy to a Marine base after they met, so maybe Dragon escorted Luffy's mom somewhere to kind of flip that idea on its head. And another potential tie to this whole escorting idea could be how Garp was the one tasked with escorting the fishmen from the most recent reverie. And since I spent a lot of this video kind of contrasting the Celestial Dragons and the fishmen, having Garp's son escort a noble at some point could be a cool twist. And on top of that, I think a really cool detail is that we know Garp wasn't even supposed to be at God Valley. He was on vacation and got called in because Roger showed up. So who was helping escort the nobles in his absence? Maybe it was his son Dragon. And I think it would be really cool if right before this all happened, Dragon earned some kind of big promotion that not only earned him the right to escort the Celestial Dragons, but maybe also earned him the Wind Logia fruit that so many people theorize that he has, including myself, because a lot of high-ranking Marines are given Logia fruits. Usually it's the admirals, but we've also seen vice admirals with them, such as Kuzan and Ohara, who still had the ice fruit. And so with Dragon probably being a prodigy, you know, being Monkey D. Garp's son, he was probably given the Wind Logia pretty early on, I would imagine, because it would also really help him protect the Celestial Dragons, which may have been his role at God Valley. And just in case you don't know why the Wind Logia seems like such a likely option for Dragon, well, pretty much every time we see Dragon, we see wind somewhere. Like whenever he was in Logtown, there's a big gust of wind. If you go back to when Grey Terminal was burnt 12 years ago, they were saying how there's strong winds in the area, and you can even see in all the panels that there's wind gusts. And even when Dragon gets back to the Wind Grandma after saving Sabo, you see like a little twirl of wind near his feet in the anime. And if God Valley was the thing that made Dragon leave the Marines, whether he did it immediately or even a few years later after having time to reflect on it, I think the Wind Fruit would be the perfect thing to let him still visit Luffy's mom on the regular, because he could then sneak into the Holy Land like a breeze in the wind and update Luffy's mom on the people he's been freeing around the world. It would almost remind me a little bit of Usopp visiting Kaya, where Usopp would tell her these grand stories of his adventures, except dragon stories are probably all legit. And Luffy's mom would probably be stuck in Marijois just like Kaya was stuck in her mansion. Because even if she did want to come down from the Red Line, it's not like the world would readily accept her knowing her past as a noble. We saw that with Doflamingo and his family after Homing moved them down from the Red Line. And we're actually going to touch back on that idea when we get to Luffy's actual birth, since the same would apply to him if people knew. But the important thing is that Dragon and Luffy's mom would have definitely had to keep their relationship a secret, just like Kaya and Usopp, ironically, not just because Dragon is a major criminal, but because he's also a D clan member. I mean, what do you think Imu or the Gorosei would do if they heard a celestial dragon is having kids with someone who held the initial D? He would probably kill them on the spot, just like he did to Cobra. And this would only aid the idea I mentioned earlier about Luffy being a chosen one type character. By him having both the blood of the nobles and the D clan could be a major part of what makes him so special. I mean, if you look at Bonnie, who is also half celestial dragon, she also went Gear 5th by using her own devil fruit powers. Maybe there's something special to the celestial dragon DNA that actually lets people grow to become more powerful, which would be a really good contrast to the Will of D, because that's not really about the lineage factor or the DNA. It's about the inherited will itself. So it's almost like the D clan and celestial dragons are like opposing families in that way, where one is about the actual bloodline and one is about the inherited will. And I do plan to drop a video soon about what might be so important about the celestial dragon's DNA, so make sure to click subscribe for that. But regardless of this forbidden love angle between Dragon and Luffy's mom, Dragon probably didn't want anyone knowing about it regardless, because it would be a really bad look for his freedom fighter friends. Imagine if the Revolutionary Army found out he's hooking up with one of the exact people they're trying to take down. So I think that regardless of what Dragon was doing between 38 and 25 years ago, he probably still had to go and meet Luffy's mom in secrecy. And like I said, a Wind Logia would just be perfect for that so he could travel around quick enough. Plus, you know, one of Kuma's main things is sending people around the world very quickly, so I think Dragon being able to do that, but maybe even better, also makes a lot of sense. But if Luffy's mom's overarching goal was to change the celestial dragons from within while she stayed in Marijois, while Dragon went and did it in the outside world by liberating the countries who pay the celestial dragons tribute, I think that would just weave together so perfectly for Oda. Because one thing that we also know about Dragon, or knew at least, is that he actually hates war. I know we associate him with declaring war on the nobles, but Vegapunk said very clearly when they met at Ohara that Dragon hates war. I mean, even when the Revolutionary Army attacked the Holy Land, their main thing was to destroy the food stores and get Kuma back, not necessarily to just slaughter all the nobles. He's waging a resource war instead of a violent one. Although I will add the caveat that Vegapunk said that before Luffy was born, so what happened to Luffy's mom may have changed Dragon's attitude eventually. But before we get there, I do want to touch on Dragon's history with the freedom fighters, which again could have started basically anywhere from 38-ish to 25 years ago. And all we really know about them is that they didn't have a lot of money, Vegapunk considered it a ragtag operation, and they incited riots in several countries 25 years ago. It also seems that Dragon was a prominent figure within that group, as Kuma even looked up to him as a hero for his actions and wanted to save people just like he was. And at least when they came to Sorbet 22 years ago, Dragon and Ivankov seemed to be the top ranking members, because with Kuma joining, which turned the two pillars of the organization into three, is when they adopted a new name, which was the Revolutionary Army. But now my question is, was that always the case with the freedom fighters? Like, did Dragon form the freedom fighters from scratch as the leader since day one? Or was there a preceding group of freedom fighters that Dragon joined and eventually took over? Well, this is where we need to bring in a character named Gabiru. Now, some of you might be wondering who the hell that is, and that's totally fair, because we don't even really know what his official name is, because the manga has used Gabiru, Gobble, and Gabol, but this guy was the one who was featured in Caribou's cover story who looked just like Caribou. And the reason why he might tie to the freedom fighters is that we already know he was a revolutionist commander, at least on the Winter Island where we learn about him on. And you can see the star insignia on his hat and his collar, which might tie to what we saw in the panel where Dragon starts the Revolutionary Army, because you can see 3 stars on his shirt, meaning those might tie to someone's rank or length of service or something. And the island where we were first introduced to Gabiru on, which is still unnamed by the way, way, was said to be one of Kaido's favorite islands, and it actually seems to be a man-made island because everything is metal. Even the mountains in the back are fake because we saw them being constructed in this panel with X-Drake that happened during the time skip. He beat Scotch there, and that's how he joined Kaido's crew. But then once Caribou got there, we saw the mountains were completed. And now the main gag with Gabiru in this cover story is that everyone mistook Caribou for that guy. There was even an old lady that took care of Caribou because Gabiru was her son and Caribou reminded her of him. And this woman looked like she was pretty up there in age, so that makes me think Gabiru could have definitely been around Dragon's age of 55 if he were still alive today. Which then makes me think that maybe Gabiru just started the Freedom Fighters but died at some point, where Dragon then took over and the rest is history. And if you're doubting that this cover story is going to hold any weight in the main story, well, this was one of the very few cover stories that actually got animated, because in episode 921 we sort of got this slideshow of the cover story after meeting Caribou in the Udon prison. And one of the stills did show Gabiru, so maybe Oda's adding some emphasis on this guy for a reason. I mean, they haven't even animated Enel going to the freaking moon yet, but they did do Gabiru, so maybe he is going to be important. Not to mention the fact that Caribou himself is becoming more important in the story now by being with Blackbeard and likely revealing the location of some ancient weapons. And speaking of Caribou being with Blackbeard, I think another potential connection to Gabiru is how the Revolutionary Army just destroyed the Celestial Dragon's food stores, and now they're having trouble getting more supplies up the Bondolas. Because what character in the story has been shown to store and supply people with large amounts of food? Caribou. He did it for Luffy a couple of times already. So what if Caribou ends up working with Blackbeard to feed all the Celestial Dragons and then get in their good graces? That would throw a huge wrench in Dragon's plan that he and his army work so hard for. It could be a really interesting way to lead into the Dragon and Gabiru connections. Like maybe Caribou is directly conflicting with Gabiru's will at this point. Or maybe the actual lesson is that Dragon went too far by destroying all that food, and Gabiru wouldn't have done this, so Caribou was kind of fixing it in his place. I mean, maybe Gabiru was even the previous owner of the swamp fruit. One of the other translations for his name is just gobble, like he's gobbling things up, somewhat like Caribou does with food or mermaids sometimes, so that could honestly fit. Maybe he was even a Marine with Dragon back in the day, where they both got Logias for getting promotions, but then they just bounced. But that's about all I have to say for the Freedom Fighters, so let's now talk about what Dragon did after the Revolutionary Army started 22 years ago. Because there are a few important events that occurred around this time period, with the first being the Ohara incident, which happened the same year but right before starting the army, the next being Luffy's birth, which was 3 years after that, or 19 years ago, and then also Dragon getting his famous tattoo, which happened sometime before Ginny getting captured 14 years ago. And now what's important about this tattoo is that we also saw the symbol on his leg when he was just a freedom fighter. So there is something important to this thing for sure, and it's not something that just ties to Luffy or Luffy's mom, I think, even if maybe his birth is what led to him getting it tattooed right on his face. There's obviously some kind of history to it. And here I want to shout out a great video by Randy Troy about Luffy's lineage, and I highly recommend watching that even after this one, because he goes back several generations for both paternal and maternal ancestry. And in the event you somehow don't buy this whole theory today, well, Randy's got a totally different one for Luffy's mom anyway that you can check out. But the reason I bring up his video is he talked about the connections between Dragon and Calgara. And now I won't go through every bit of detail, but the major points for this are that they both have tattoos on their face. Calgara threw a giant cannonball on a chain in his introduction, which Garp did after we met him in Eni's lobby, and the Shandorian elders wore a dog mask just like Garp does. Seto kinda looks like Luffy, and some other things. And it all basically makes it feel like Calgara is probably a distant relative of the Monkey D family. So whatever Dragon's tattoo is, I think it's definitely harkening back to that. Not necessarily that Dragon is associated with Skypiea, although that wouldn't surprise me if he does have the wind fruit, but rather that he's just so serious about his ideals that he'll put it right on his face so you know about them. Like he's not afraid to show what he's about or pay homage to what's important to him kind of thing. And I do have two guesses for what that tattoo might be symbolizing, with the first one being something as simple as just the reverse of the world government logo, where instead of 4 lines connecting at the center, kind of showing some sort of unification, it's 4 lines being broken free from the center, like he wants countries to be independent and free instead of aiding in the world government's resource network, which he obviously has been helping islands do for years now. And then the other idea that I have for this is that it could just be symbolizing the poneglyphs, like maybe the squares resemble the stones themselves and the lines on the outside are like protecting them, which would really tie to Calgara since protecting his poneglyph was his biggest goal. And Dragon has also called Robin the light of the revolution, likely due in large part to her ability to read the poneglyphs since Dragon was close to Clover and the scholars and everything, so he's obviously very aware of the importance of the poneglyphs to the world. But now let's move on to the point where Luffy is actually born and his mom presumably perished, which is probably what most of you have been waiting for, so I applaud you for sticking around, and my theories for this part kind of rely on one major factor. After Luffy was born in the Holy Land, did the Celestial Dragons ever find out that Dragon was the father? And the reason I say this is that people today obviously know that the famous Monkey D. Luffy is Dragon's son, but if Luffy was born in the Holy Land, then he probably had a different name at first, right? Like one with Saint in it, and probably his mom's surname. Almost being an inversion to Ace, who was born Gold D. Ace, but took the name Porcus D. Ace instead. And that's really important to think about, because if Luffy was then taken away by Dragon in secret as a child, and Luffy's mom never revealed who the father was, then the nobles would have no idea that the Luffy of today is the kid from back then. They wouldn't even know that there's a connection between Dragon and whatever Luffy's mom's name was either. And the reason she died would be completely separate from Dragon then. And we'll get into why that is in just a minute, but I think Dragon may have changed Luffy's name to his after that, because having a Celestial Dragon name would basically be a death sentence for Luffy if he lived among the commoners. I mean, like I mentioned earlier, we saw with Doflamingo how the Tenryubito can be treated. And it's all kind of ironic to me, because even though Dragon is the most wanted criminal in the world, he is pretty popular amongst the common folk, so his name would still be safer in the world. And this is all really important because back then, while Luffy's mom was pregnant, you'd kinda have to imagine that the other nobles were at least asking her who the father was, right? And I think it would also be a little suspicious if she kept it a secret as well. And this leads to an interesting, albeit dark, discussion about whether or not female Celestial Dragons get to have multiple slave husbands in the same way that we have unfortunately seen the male Celestial Dragons do with their multiple wives, like we saw in Sharlos's introduction in Sabaody, as well as the Ginny situation, of course. I mean, you probably would assume that they could do that, but the vital difference here between the groups is that the female Celestial Dragons would actually have to carry the baby if there were any slip-ups. So I would imagine they're at least kinda picky about it, and maybe they usually only have kids with other Celestial Dragons for that reason. But the reason I bring this up is twofold. One is that it could have given Luffy's mom somewhat of an alibi. I mean, we already see Dragon sneak around with a hood over his head a lot of the time in the world as it is, so maybe when he visited her in the Holy Land, he just hid his identity and acted like he was one of her slave husbands, or her only one probably. And if you think it might be kind of hard for Dragon to hide his identity while in Marijois, well, nobody noticed that Rayleigh was pretending to be a slave in the Sabaody auction house, so we kinda have an example there. And then later when Luffy's mom got pregnant, she could maybe have even pinned it on Dragon as some kind of accident without revealing who the man truly was. And the other reason why this is vital is that it gives a brand new context to Dragon's decision to not go after Ginny, as well as Luffy's connection to Bonnie, because Dragon would have sort of been in Ginny's shoes before. Not that he suffered nearly the same horrific outcome she did, of course, not even close, because Luffy's mom probably treated Dragon like normal, but he would at least understand the situation a little bit, including how hard it is for people to escape. If this is true, I bet you Dragon saw countless people come up and try to retrieve their loved ones just to die and almost make everything worse. And maybe even more importantly, Dragon would have seen that even when one slave is saved, another one is then kidnapped to take their place. In that element of it all is where we need to again bring up Fisher Tiger, because Fisher Tiger initially escaped 16 years ago, but then went back 15 years ago to free even more slaves, like Boa for example, and then 14 years ago is when Ginny was taken. I think it's very conceivable that if Fisher Tiger did not go and save those slaves, then Ginny would not have been kidnapped. Now, I could be wrong, of course, because the nobles are always getting slaves apparently, but if the Celestial Dragons lost a bunch of slaves just 1 year prior to that, it does kind of make sense that they would go out trying to find new ones to replace them, right? This is actually the exact reason that Mjosgard even made it down to Fishman Island in the first place. He wanted to go get his slaves back that escaped a few years prior because of Fisher Tiger, which makes all of this really come full circle, because Fisher Tiger's actions led to Mjosgard's actions, which then led to Otohime's, which then led to them getting the chance to join the Reverie, and then the rest is basically history. So Dragon may have known that even if they went and saved Ginny, another person would just be taken to suffer in her place. And this juxtaposition of Dragon and Fisher Tiger's decision making is a perfect example of what I mentioned earlier about the dragons and tigers in Chinese mythology. And then here's the real kicker to all of this, and probably my favorite part of this entire video. What if the reason that Luffy's mom was was killed was because she was the one responsible for freeing Fisher Tiger. So maybe she was put to death by the God's Knights afterward for helping the fishmen, thus truly paralleling Otohime and Mjosgard, because not only is it a fishman she's saving, like Mjosgard did, but it's arguably one of the most famous fishmen of all time in Fisher Tiger. And despite being enslaved and disliking the humans as much as he did, he still never wanted his crew to kill them. And he even admitted at the end of his life that Otohime's approach was the right one. So if Mjosgard was reformed by Otohime in the past, then it would make some sense that Fisher Tiger was reformed by an Otohime counterpart, which in this case would obviously be Luffy's mom. And now, to be fair, we don't yet know that Fisher Tiger was even freed by somebody, but we weren't really given a lot of detail on how that happened in general. And you know, it's really hard to escape the Holy Land, so I think this is definitely plausible. And what's really important here is that Luffy would have only been 3 at this point, or maybe like 2.5 by the time Fisher Tiger was freed, because he made it back to Fishman Island 16 years ago, meaning he was probably freed a little bit before that, I assume. And that's probably still early enough to where Luffy isn't gonna remember anything. So if Luffy's mom was then killed after that, but Dragon took him away in secret, it might be kind of the perfect time frame for Luffy to not really remember much of his life early on, and thus why he doesn't talk about it now. Although there was one time where he kind of did. Remember when Boa showed Luffy the mark of the Celestials on her back, and Luffy said that he remembered seeing it somewhere before? He ended up thinking about the Sun Pirate symbol, but they aren't even really all that alike. What if he's just kind of misremembering because he did see the Celestial Dragon logo before, but up in Marijois when he was a little kid? Maybe he even saw the one that the Revolutionary Army targeted during the Reverie. And what makes this idea hit even harder is that if Luffy's mom didn't free Fisher Tiger, then Fisher Tiger wouldn't have gone back to free other slaves like Boa, for example, which means that Luffy's mom is then sort of responsible for the freedom of the woman who loves Luffy today. Without her actions, that connection would have never happened. And so, like I said, freeing Fisher Tiger probably had Luffy's mom executed by the God's Knights just like Mjosgard did. But then the big question there is, what was Dragon's response to all this? Well, his response was probably just nothing. And I know we might laugh at that because Dragon never does anything, but that's kind of the beauty of this, because if Dragon did do something, like trying to save her and escape, or just beat the God's Knight straight up, he would have blown his cover. That's why I said earlier that it's really important to know whether the Celestial Dragons found out that Dragon was the father of that kid, because if that was ever revealed, the Celestial Dragons would immediately kill Luffy, or even if he escaped, it would let the world know of his true identity, because that would hurt Dragon's stature among his own army, and maybe more importantly, the entire world, who would not like hearing that he's in bed with the enemy. It would put his entire life's mission, and his wife's mission, honestly, at risk. The whole world would look at Dragon like a giant fraud, just like we do today. And it's kind of ironic in that sense. Dragon is sacrificing his stature among us readers to maintain the hope that the world has because of him. I mean, imagine Dragon standing right next to his wife who is being crucified, and he just sat there in silence. Or maybe he just walked away because he wanted to go get Luffy and get out of there. All because of the goals that she and him had planned together, and because they wanted to give Luffy a chance at a free life. And what I think is really interesting to mention here is that when Mjosgard died recently, it was said that the world would not hear about that event, which is a stark contrast to what the Celestial Dragons normally do, where they make big spectacles of their executions to make examples out of people. But for Mjosgard, maybe they just didn't want the world having the example of a Celestial Dragon that could be good, or could be human. And the same probably goes for Luffy's mom. And this is what we learned way back from Hiryuluk, that you're not dead until you're forgotten. Because Luffy's mom probably has been forgotten by almost the entire world, and is scorned by the few people who remember her in the Holy Land, except for, of course, Dragon. And honestly, I bet you she doesn't care about that at all, because at the end of the day, they just wanted their son and the world to be free. Which would have been hard even if Luffy just stayed up in the Holy Land and lived as a noble. He would have been kind of prescribed to a certain lifestyle, and one that he probably doesn't like that much. Even if you go back to Dragon's first interaction with Sabo, who was also a noble, Sabo Sabo told him how rotten the people are within his home district, and specifically that if he stays there, he will never be free. I think Dragon and Luffy's mom thought the very same thing about Luffy back in the day. Sabo even went on to say that he was ashamed to have been born a noble, and Dragon sort of thought to himself, see what you have driven this innocent child to say? Which again just highlights how aware Dragon is about what nobility does to people. And later on, Dragon even made a very important comment to Ivankov about this, where he said, even a rotten land like this can still produce innocent children. What if he knows this lesson so well because his son is a shining example of it? It's that whole nature versus nurture thing. People aren't born being terrible, but they can learn to be. So for Luffy, Dragon probably knew that he would never be free living in the Holy Land, nor would he be free if the world found out he was a noble. He was kind of stuck in that regard, so there was probably only one path for Dragon to take, which is to get Luffy out of there without blowing his cover, which means he doesn't get to retaliate at all, knowing that he could not do anything even if he was stronger than the God's Knights, because then Luffy would not get to live a free life. And this could all set up a mega reveal later on when the other nobles find out that Luffy is the kid from way back when, thus building their grudge against each other even more, where Luffy finds out the nobles killed his mom, and the nobles find out that Luffy's mom was responsible for freeing one of the fishmen. But I also think that this could potentially provide a segue for Luffy and the Celestial Dragons to eventually work together, because Luffy might be an example of a Celestial Dragon who didn't grow up being taught that he was a god of the world, and he ended up being alright, which is sort of ironic because he's now the sun god, but that gives some credence to the idea that the Celestial Dragons are just people who've been taught to behave a certain way. If the Celestial Dragons weren't born being taught that they can have slaves and all this stuff, then maybe they wouldn't grow up being giant pieces of human trash. And if Luffy was eventually somehow able to change them from within, not saying that they're going to get redeemed, but maybe make them be slightly better, that would almost be like Luffy is finishing what his mom tried to do, where he gets the Celestial Dragons to see the error in their ways, at least a little bit. But now, here's a really interesting question for you. What was Luffy's mom's name? Well, if we use Sanji and Zoro's mom's names as an example, the Wings of the Pirate King, their moms were named Sora and Terra. Sora means sky in Japanese, and Terra is a word that basically means earth in a few different languages, but this sky and earth connection might give us some ideas about what Luffy's mom's name is. And the first idea that I had, which might be kind of obvious at this point, is the name Umi, because that would mean sea in Japanese, which would kind of complete the trio with the other moms, but that would also be spelled the opposite way to the name Emu, which could make for a pretty cool twist. But now maybe the one issue with this is that we actually already have somebody named Umi in the story. It was Robin's instructor when Robin was undercover early on in the Wano arc. So if Oda isn't going to go the Umi route, then I think another great option would be the name Celeste or Celestia, because that would obviously tie to space, which makes sense since Luffy is the sun god now. And I do think it would be kind of funny if Oda made Luffy's parents named Celeste and then Dragon, thus almost combining for the name Celestial Dragon, like he was hiding away the fact Luffy was one all along. I feel like that's something Oda would do. And then for this very last section of the video, I want to talk about another person who may be soon revealed to be related to Celestial Dragons, and that is Admiral Greenbull, because when he was introduced in Wano, he immediately was preaching about how prejudice breeds stability, and that humanity has only gotten this far by enforcing hierarchies. I mean, it already sounds a lot like how the Celestial Dragons think, if you ask me, but more importantly, Greenbull also looks a lot like our homeboy Don Quixote Mjosgard. Like, these dudes probably have to be related somehow. However, they probably aren't siblings because Greenbull is not currently a Celestial Dragon. And yes, we do know that part of the Don Quixote family did leave the Holy Land at some point, but that doesn't really lead us anywhere because they all died except for Doflamingo. However, we did get a look at Mjosgard's dad in one of the flashbacks, and he honestly looks nothing like him, but that guy does look like someone else that we've seen before, which is King Bikori, the guy who tried to overthrow Sorbet Kingdom a couple of times, but was thwarted by Kuma and the Revolutionary Army. This dude was basically a wannabe Celestial Dragon, and had all the qualifications as far as personality goes at least, and Bikori was beaten the first time 22 years ago when Greenbull would have been 19, and with the way Bikori looked back then, I think he definitely could have been around 40 at that point, so it does kind of line up timeline-wise. So maybe Bikori's parents also left Marijwa in the distant past, meaning that now Greenbull is like a commoner who acts like a world noble, while Mjosgard was a world noble who came now to respect the commoners. But alright guys, if you made it to the end of this video, I want to give you a massive thank you. If you enjoyed it, please let me know by liking or subscribing, and if if you'd like to hear more, then head over to my second channel where I have some podcast-style discussions I've been doing with other One Piece creators that you might like to listen to. But until next time, later.